The Art of Being Ruled. Wyndham Lewis. Original publication 1926. 1989 edition. Narrated by Skeptical Waves. Part 12. The Intellectual. Chapter 3. The Great God Flux. Waheva adds, since the publication of Bergson's Données Immédiates de la Conscience, a series of movements, given the widest publicity, and affecting every branch of educational activity, which might have originated in a single brain, which all bear the same stamp. As an example of this, Bergson has announced that he is in such agreement with Einstein that he will devote the rest of his life to adjusting his philosophy to the relativity theory. Whence comes this unusual unanimity? Is it because at length the intellectual leaders are at one? Are the less unfortunate results of it due to the popularizers only? Or are we witnessing the sudden flowering of a certain human type, which the political atmosphere especially favors? The latter is, I believe, the case. Its supreme expansion is all round us, a display probably never to be repeated. Sorel says, we must not judge a century by the famous people whose works come down to us from it. Illusions du progrès. They contradict it rather than express it, he says. Faguet said likewise that good writers, far from embodying, as was generally supposed, the prejudices of their time, did the exact contrary, namely, they opposed them. But Benda says, writing in 1918, that Faguet's remark is no longer true. Writers now, he says, never contradict the prejudices and ideas accepted and favored by their epoch. They are its careful flunkies. This significant amendment of Benda should be given especial attention. How true it is, you only have to pass in review a few of the most eminent figures to convince yourself of. The causes of this new conformity are analyzed throughout this book. What I have just said above about the flowering of a unique type to the practical exclusion of any other is another way of putting it. The over-political nature and great fundamental uniformity of all contemporary thought is another. It is in the very sullage or backwash of revolution that these unanimous organisms thrive. There is hardly a mind that could be properly described as revolutionary among them. There are none that are original, for the plain reason that they are all on the side of the big battalions. They are all the reliable servants of a rigid program. Their great political services should be evident to anybody. But if pure science and the free speculative mind are to survive, they must evidently at this point divorce themselves from politics. It is in order to escape from politics that it is necessary to analyze this situation so radically. The relativity theory, the Copernican upheaval, or any great scientific convulsion, leaves a new landscape. There is a period of stunned dreariness, then people begin, ant-like, the building of a new human world. They soon forget the last disturbance. But from these shocks they derive a slightly augmented vocabulary, a new blind spot in their vision, a few new blepharospasms or tics, and perhaps a revised method of computing time. Time, especially, has received a very severe shaking from Einstein, although it is not by any means a new experience for that ancient abstraction, nor will it be the last. The immediate effect of the latest upset can be traced everywhere in the press and writing generally by a universal squint at anything in the shape of a value. This squint, usually circumspectly hidden, has never been more open and malignant. The born crook, gulping down his first thrill of alarm, welcomes almost any period of disorder, certain that he can turn it to good account. A tramp in an earthquake, riding heartily on the naked billows of the field where he has been sleeping, must watch the cloud-capped towers of the lords of the earth crumbling with satisfaction. The man in the street, from the street, will cock an exultant eye at the collapse of some expensive monument to which he has always had to pay lip service, as well as money for upkeep, but which he has liked as little as he has understood it. What have these humble figures to do, you may ask, with Copernican upheavals or Einstein's theories? Einstein, for instance, can never be of any importance to the world at large. But the plain man, the intellectual crook, and the society hostess are the only people, for all practical purposes, with whom we have to deal. And they are affected by, and use for their own peculiar ends, any scientific disturbance. Benda, I think, is wrong, therefore, in supposing that Einstein has not done his bit in the salon in the street. It is true that what a great discovery means to most people is something big, picturesque, and utilizable. Darwin penetrated everywhere, in the form of a great scientist who said that men were descended from monkeys. Einstein has penetrated everywhere as a great scientist who has said that everything was relative, or, as Pirandello popularizes it for the stage, if you think it is so, then it is so. How true or false an interpretation this may be of Einstein I am not discussing. The popular upshot of the relativity theory, then, is to shake people's confidence everywhere in their own opinion, but it enables them to circumvent other people's. So, popularly, relativity is another agent of emancipation from the fixed to the superfluid. And this fluidity is the lifeblood of the philosophy of Bergson. Briefly, the root impulse in Bergson's philosophy was a rendering back to life, majuscular abstraction of a feverish chaos, all that the mind had taken from her to build into forms and concepts. Perhaps by quoting a few passages from Bergson's Introduction to Metaphysics, contact can be established at once with his mind. Philosophy, he says, can only be an effort to transcend the human condition. But the thought of man as far as it is simply human he has just described as consisting in the erection of stations in the wilderness, points along the line of the flight of Zeno's celebrated arrow, concepts like towers above Heraclitus' famous flux. To replunge entirely into this flux, to become the flux and taste it, to be the intuitive knowledge which instills itself in that which is moving and adopts the very life of things, in his words, will be to attain the absolute. In this way the man in the street is provided with an absolute. He did not ask for one, it is what might be termed a philosopher's present. But the philosopher, bending his courtly eye on him, may think he'd rather have that funny present than nothing. How could they, the masters of modern philosophy, have abstained from placing themselves in what we call concrete duration? They have done so to a greater extent than they were aware, above all, much more than they said. If we endeavor to link together, by a continuous connection, the intuitions about which systems have become organized, we find, together with other convergent and divergent lines, one very determinate direction of thought and feeling. What is this latent thought? How shall we express the feeling? To borrow once more the language of the Platonists, we will say, depriving the words of their psychological sense, and giving the name of idea to a certain settling down into an easy intelligibility, and that of soul to a certain longing after the restlessness of life, that an inevitable current causes modern philosophy to place the soul above the idea. It thus tends, like modern science, and even more so than modern science, to advance in an opposite direction to ancient thought. Before this he has summarized, to philosophize, therefore, is to invert the habitual direction of thought. And that inversion consists in placing the intelligence within the mobile reality and reversing the direction of the operation by which it habitually thinks. Again, the Kantian criticism is valid especially against a science and a metaphysic presenting themselves with the architectural simplicity of the Platonic theory of ideas or of a Greek temple. The dream of a universal mathematic is itself but a survival of Platonism. Universal mathematic is what the world of ideas becomes when we suppose that the idea consists in a relation or in a law, and no longer in a thing. The thing is the heart of the popularized version of the Einstein theory. The invisible current that causes modern philosophy to place the soul above the idea, and which gives it a certain longing for the restlessness of life, is the current that I have been talking about above. It is the plunge into the stream of life, smashing the watchtowers, Baudelaire, lighthouses, as the futurists recommended, identifying yourself with the fluid and the natural, becoming capable of following reality in all its sinuosities, that produces the typical conventional modernist, false revolutionary tendency, and the support for the organized hatred of the intellect spoken of by Benda. Bergson is throughout recommending capitulation to the material in struggle against which the greatest things in the world have been constructed. This fashionable, unskeletal, feminine philosopher of the flux wished, with more chance of succeeding than the merely very noisy Marinetti, to deliver all this up to the river god, to the god flux, once more. I am an artist, and, through my eye, must confess to a tremendous bias. In my purely literary voyages my eye is always my compass. The architectural simplicity, whether of a Platonic idea or a Greek temple, I far prefer to no idea at all, or no temple at all, or, for instance, to most of the complicated and too tropical structures of India. Nothing could ever convince my eye, even if my intelligence were otherwise overcome, that anything that did not possess this simplicity, conceptual quality, hard exact outline, grand architectural proportion, was the greatest art. Bergson is indeed the arch-enemy of every impulse having its seat in the apparatus of vision, and requiring a concrete world. Bergson is the enemy of the eye, from the start, though he might arrive at some emotional compromise with the ear. But I can hardly imagine any way in which he is not against every form of intelligent life.